Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Assistant Manager of Visitor Experience here at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome back to all of you who've been with us before, and especially welcome to the new people. This virtual series features programs about Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories of the trolley era and our collection that you can experience from home, usually on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And we plan to continue these programs regularly as long as I can find presenters. So if you have a show that you would like to share that fits our museum mission, please let me know. That would be anything about Pennsylvania, the trolley era, or cities where our streetcars come from. If you have a program that doesn't quite fit those guidelines, please reach out anyway. My email address is in the confirmation email that you got for this program today. And you can see a full list of upcoming presentations on our website, patrolley.org, which I'll share in the chat box in a few minutes. We've only got one more scheduled in the immediate future, but I'll get to that shortly. I want to extend a very special thank you to those of you who donated when registering for tonight's program, and those of you who have made donations through our website or by check this year. We really, really appreciate your support of our virtual outreach programs. And most of you know all about the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, but for those who might be new, we were established in 1954 as the Arden Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And the museum opened to visitors just a few years later in 1963 and is located along the route of the former interurban line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. You'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars here. About 20 of them operate. About 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. And we have some really awesome updates to share with you. But before I get into those, I want to thank everybody who is a volunteer here. It's National Volunteer Week, so whether you're one of our volunteers at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum or if you volunteer at another rail museum around the country, thank you so much for your dedication and support. Most of these museums couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you very, very much. Happy National Volunteer Week. So the photos that you see here are the installation of the new solar panels on top of our trolley display building. This has been completed. There's a few more things that need to be done, but this shows we are well on our way to having solar powered streetcars at our museum. Let's see. A couple other awesome things. We've got windows on our new Welcome and Education Center right now, which you can see the picture on the left. There's also drywall going up inside. It's all very, very, very exciting. And on the right side, you'll see a lot of people boarding trolleys on Volunteer Boulevard. So this was during our Bunny Trolley event on the weekends around Easter. We had actually over 1,000 people a day for 4 of the 5 days of Bunny Trolley. So it was an awesome way to start the season. If you came out for that, thank you very much. It was very busy and really great to see so many people coming out to the museum. And lastly, here's one of those pictures inside. I think this entryway for the new museum looks really cool on the left there. It's going to have really high ceilings, so it's really it's going to make a really neat impression when you come in. And then on the right-hand side, we partner with the Penn State Master Gardeners. They're starting some landscaping, and we've got Falcone Plaza right here. We've got a new fountain. And in the background, you can see Wexford Station is a little bit rustic looking right now, but that should be painted very shortly. If you are one of our members or volunteers, on April 29th, we're having a Members Day and a Volunteer Appreciation Dinner. So if you haven't already RSVP'd for that, please do that by April 20th so we can let the caterer know how many people we're expecting. All right, and now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Rich Krisak. Rich is a native Clevelander. He got his start as an intern with the Regional Transit Authority in Cleveland during university and has a degree in urban planning from Cleveland State University. He's a 40-plus year transit professional, and his last position was Chief Operating Officer at MARTA in Atlanta. He's been involved in planning, designing, and operating new starts, including Buffalo, Dallas, Houston, Boston, and the Atlanta streetcar. Rich is semi-retired, and he's been doing consulting work, which has kept him pretty busy lately. At the end of this presentation, we will have a question and answer session with our presenter, but the chat box is open, so please feel free to enter questions and comments during the show. I might pop in if it's related to a particular slide, but we'll read through most of those at the end. And just to note, this program is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube. And I just want to remind everyone, we'll keep our microphones muted, and we'll now turn off our videos during the presentation so that we can minimize distractions. I will invite you to turn all those back on at the end. All right, Rich, if you're ready, take it away.
All right. Let me get this queued up here to the right side. There we go. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. You're in like the slideshow view mode if you want to go full screen.
Okay, let's see. How do I do full screen?
Slideshow, the tab that says slideshow. Hopefully it's not
Yep,
covered
got
by
it.
your. Yep. And then from beginning.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. I'm glad you can make it. First off, I wanted to thank Scott Becker because he's actually the reason that I did this presentation. I saw him at the last West Penn meet, and I told him I was getting ready to do another presentation. I was going to do something on Coleman Car Company, and he said, "Oh no, don't do that. You know, please give us another segment on Cleveland because there isn't a lot that's been covered on Cleveland. It's really interesting. We learned stuff. We learned a lot from the last one. Could you just do your next installment of Cleveland?" So this is my next installment of Cleveland. So I wanted to thank Scott for getting me kind of encouraged to do it. It's been a lot of fun. I've done a lot of research. I spent the past 2 or 3 months or so putting this together. So I'm focusing on the 1955 to 1975 era. The reason I ended at 1975 was because that's when the RTA took over direct operation of CTS and Shaker and other subsidiary transit agencies. It was actually passed in 74, but they didn't take control of the systems until 75. So it seemed like a good break period to stop. 1955, of course, I chose because that's when the rapid transit started. So this kind of gives you a 20-year snapshot of Cleveland transit history. If you're interested in looking at the previous presentation, like Kristen mentioned, you can get it on YouTube, PTM. That covered the post-World War II era, the modernization plans, and the streetcar service, the beginning of the rapid transit, trackless trolleys, and all kinds of other things. So there's a lot to cover in this 20-year period, so I'm going to try to focus on the highlights. I'm sure I missed a lot of things that people are going to say, why don't you talk about this, or why don't you talk about that? But I try to kind of focus here. I give photo credits where I can give them as appropriate. A lot of these slides you'll see as we go forward, I bought off of eBay. eBay is a great source of material, but not necessarily a great source of the author of the material. So where I have the photo credits, I use them. Where I didn't, obviously, I don't know. So I wanted to issue a warning at the beginning of the presentation, and that this is all human content. There's no AI involved in this. I watched 60 Minutes all about AI. I just want to be sure that he understands that I did this myself. This is all human. So just for everybody's information. So the illustration you see on the left of the slide here, this was actually done for Pullman Standard. This was a Pullman Standard advertisement that they issued in 1968 to kind of celebrate the beginning of the CTS Airport Rapid Extension. So I thought it was really kind of a cool, colorful image. I bought this off of eBay, the actual magazine advertising, and I scanned it and actually have it hanging up in my train. Okay, so just to kind of recap, 1954, was the end of streetcar service in Cleveland. It ended on a promotion from the Cleveland Press to offer free rides on the Madison Avenue streetcar line from Public Square to West 65th and Bridge. The PCCs were already gone by this point, so 4000s that you see in the left there picture were the cars that were still left around running. And the PCCs were off the property by 1953 to Toronto. So this gives you kind of an idea of the new era of transit in Cleveland in the mid-50s. So we got a nice new looking bus, we got the rapid transit, and we have a major trackless trolley system that is frequently overlooked by a lot of people. And we'll kind of get to that later in the presentation. So the Cleveland Rapid Transit, the original line, which is from the station number 1 to station number 2 over here, West 117th, started at Windermere Station. That was opened in 2 phases. So the first phase opened in March of 1955, and that took us from Windermere Station down to Cleveland Union Terminal. And then the second phase opened just a short couple months later to West 117th from the downtown terminal over to West 117th. And then later came a 2-mile extension over to West Park, which we'll talk about. So this is just some collateral material showing you the beginning of the CTS Rapid. We're very proud of this. It was a $30 million improvement for riders. It was funded by a loan from Reconstruction Finance Corporation. They were able to loan the money to CTS to get it going. Part of the conditions were that the board had to be increased to 5 people from 3, which may have been a bondholder requirement, but also the RFC, the feds were concerned that the transit board was not as independent as it should have been from city council. City council was still kind of dictating what was going on to the CTS board. So it wasn't as independent as it was intended to be. And I think that was illustrated by the fact that the CTS board actually adopted the modernization plan, the McCarter-Reed plan, which would have retained streetcars in a large subway system. And that was overturned by the city council, who hired their own independent consultant, Charles DeLue from Chicago, who said that that plan was not the right way to go and the heavy rail rapid should be built instead. So we depart here from Windermere Station. Windermere was a big streetcar facility, a large piece of property. Hang on a second here. These rapid transit cars were PCC technology based cars. They did have air on them. They were not all electrics like Chicago. There were no track brakes. They were modified a couple times after they entered service. This picture here shows you the smaller pantograph. You can see it has a pretty narrow width of the pantograph head. And it turned out that in service, the pantograph on curves when the car was rocking back and forth tended to override the contact wire and get hung up in the hangers and the messenger wire. So that pantograph head was modified. And then the other modification were the brakes on the cars. So here we see a picture actually coming at us. This is in the left hand running. This is on the joint, what Clevelanders call the joint area, which is where Shaker and CTS both share the right of way for a couple miles. CTS upgraded it. They signalized it with block signals, automatic block signals with trip stops. Shaker did not have that. They put welded rail in. They really kind of upgraded some of the features of Shaker. And then here we're going into the terminal tower. And the interesting thing was, I talked about this before in the last presentation, the Vance had such a fantastic vision for transit and transportation and development in the city of Cleveland. It's kind of unbelievable that they had that vision, because a lot of it happened over the years in Cleveland really was a direct part of their vision for the city of Cleveland. So all these tunnels, all this stuff was in place. This was built when the railroad station was built, when the CUT electrification was built. So this rapid transit train actually is coming out of what was the inner urban concourse that the Vans had built, with the intention that the inner urbans that existed at the time in the late 20s, when the terminal tower opened, would actually come into the terminal, as well as their east side and west side rapid transit, which eventually happened. So the next opening we talked about was the west side opening that came in August 1955. That was from the terminal to West 117th. Here's a picture by Bill Viber, so I think he's on the call. This is the CTS Rapid Mary Pair going across the CUT Cleveland Union Terminal Bridge across the flats. The area where the rapid train is running was already built with the vision of the West Side Rapid for the Vans crossing the bridge. So that was already there. Again, that goes back to their vision. We see a rapid transit train here headed towards West 117th. It's at approximately West 97th Street. You can see these are the newer cars that were bought for the extension to West Park. There were 20 additional cars bought. This is an express train, so if you look closely, you can see the marker lights, classification lights next to the destination sign are on white, and it's flying flags because it's an express train. It'll leave the terminal, and the first stop will be West 117th, and then it'll head over to West Park. So this is, I think, one, I would say, mistake in my book anyway, that the rapid transit made. So the Vans vision originally was not to make this transition from the nickel plate over to the New York Central. The Vans vision was to use the nickel plate to get into Lakewood. Of course, the Vans owned the nickel plate. I'm sure when CTS Rapid was being constructed, there probably wasn't a whole lot of interest in the railroad running a rapid transit service along their right-of-way through Lakewood into Rocky River and beyond. So the Rapid made the transition from running alongside the nickel plate to going up this curve, going up a hill, and then winding up at West 117th Street here at grade. So this was the original West Side Rapid Terminal. The surprising thing was it wasn't anticipated that West 117th would have such huge ridership. So when it opened, they had to add an escalator, had to add additional parking, and the ridership from this station actually exceeded Windermere, which was a huge station intended to be a big terminal station. West 117th was never really envisioned to be a terminal station. So one of the other interesting things about CTS Rapid was they really took advantage of using freight railroad right-of-way. And this was even before Boston Highland Branch extended the Green Line on a railroad right-of-way. So at the time, it was kind of a newer or novel approach to building rapid transit, cheaply, avoiding a lot of right-of-way going through major neighborhoods and building subways. But on the other hand, particularly in Lakewood's perspective, because this is the branch that would have went to Lakewood again if it would have went straight ahead, you avoided a really highly densely populated area. In fact, Lakewood had at the time, I think it still does, about 9,000 people per square mile. So if you're a planner and you're approaching that 10,000 people per square mile, that's a lot of density. Lakewood, if you go back to the old rapid transit studies and subway studies that I bought off of eBay off of the years, you'll see that Lakewood was just a huge watershed of ridership for rapid transit. And the CTS Rapid, as it was constructed, kind of skirted the edge of Lakewood, kind of around Lakewood, but didn't go through the heart of Lakewood. So it missed a lot of ridership. Also, the decision to use the Shaker right-of-way, the Advanced Virgin Shaker right-of-way to get into the terminal was a cheap way to get to downtown, but also avoided Euclid Avenue, which was the heaviest streetcar line, and then heaviest bus line in the city of Cleveland. In fact, when I was a traffic checker in the late 70s, Euclid was still scheduled at a 90-second headway for rush hour. So it basically also missed that big ridership watershed as well. So the next extension was to go to West Park, and we can thank Bill Vigers for the name of West Park. And I didn't, West Park Station, I didn't realize this until recently. I was kind of researching this presentation. So the original name was supposed to be, for the station, was supposed to be West 143rd and Lorraine, which doesn't sound incredibly romantic. Bill sent a letter to Don Hyde suggesting the name of West Park, which was a former New York Central station along the Big Four, which the CTS Rapid parallels. And it was the name of the village before it was incorporated, annexed by the city of Cleveland. So that's how West Park got the name of West Park. So the other thing I found out was Don Hyde, who was the general manager after Carter left to go head Chicago, CTA, he was the first general manager for the CTA. Don Hyde was a very creative guy when it came to financing. So this extension was actually financed by the sale of Harvard Yard. Harvard Yard was the huge streetcar complex on the east side of Cleveland that did all the rebuilding, all the maintenance, the heavy repair for Cleveland's huge streetcar system. So the sale of that property helped finance this extension. So this extension, we see the kind of opening day stuff. The extension included stations at Triscuit and West Park. And as soon as the system opened, the ridership it really exceeded all expectations. Again, I think part of that was the Lakewood watershed. Part of it was in the West Park area. You know, there were no freeways really to get into downtown Cleveland. So if you worked in downtown Cleveland and you lived out Fairview, west out in that area, you had a long slog to get into town every day. The Rapid provided a significant travel time savings to people who lived in that area before the freeways were constructed. So Bill got to ride on the opening day cars. He got to ride with the mayor because of his great suggestions. So that must have been a lot of fun. So the stations were so successful that that CTS had to buy extra property and move very quickly to add another 1,000 parking spaces. Pretty amazing how heavy that ridership, and it remained quite heavy. I remember when I was in college, if I didn't get out early to Triscuit Station, there just was no parking. I mean, I couldn't even find a parking space, so I started taking the bus to get to the Rapid station. And eventually, when I became an intern, I got a parking pass so I could park in the employee parking lot. So that kind of secured my spot. So this is West Park Yard. So when a line was extended to West Park, they built a pretty sizable storage yard at West Park. So they didn't have to deadhead all this equipment back to Windermere. There was no maintenance capability here. There was really no cleaning capability here, just kind of storage. But it was a neat place to hang out. One thing quickly you can tell between these cars, if you look at the car on the far right and the far left, there's only, next to the destination sign, there's only one marker light. If you look at the car in the middle, you'll see it has classification lights. So you've got the white, the blue, the amber classification lights. So that signifies an order from the 20 cars that were ordered for the West Park extension from St. Louis. So that's kind of an easy way to tell what kind of car you're looking at. So there were 14 married pairs and there were 6 single units. They were bought. Cleveland was kind of unique, other than maybe Chicago. that they did run a lot of off-peak service with single cars. That was the anticipation from the beginning. I think Bob Korek was part of that decision to go with the single units. So as you can see inside the car, this is a picture inside of CTS, we call them Bluebirds. They had fare boxes. So you can see where the motorman's control stand is there. There's a fare box. There's a little tray to put your cash in, to get your change, to get your transfers. So kind of an interesting setup. Again, West Park was a fun place to hang out because it was right along parallel to the Big Four mainline right away. And years ago when I was a kid, they used to run New York Central called Flexivan trains at 79 miles an hour along that stretch of track. So it was kind of a lot of fun. My dad and I used to go out here after dinner time in the summer and hang out with the yard operator, who was a friend of my dad's, here at nighttime, and just kind of watch trains go by. It was a lot of fun.
Rich, we did have a question in the chat from Paul Grether about the design influence on the rapid transit. He says, seems like a wide body, but with Chicago-style PCC technology with overhead wire instead of third rail. Do you know who the designer was, Parsons Brinkerhoff?
No, the CTS had their own equipment engineer, like a lot of old line transit agencies did. They had some very knowledgeable equipment people. So the equipment engineer worked together with St. Louis Car Company to come up with this design. So the PCC technology is sort of Chicago, like I said before, although these cars had air systems, the Chicago cars did not. The Chicago cars were all electric and they had track brakes. The Cleveland cars did not have track brakes. They are wide because they were operating in railroad right-of-way, and they could be wide. They didn't have a lot of right-of-way restrictions. Overhead pantograph use was because of Shaker. The Shaker obviously was overhead with the trolley poles. So that's where that came from as far as I know. The cars are relatively short, and they're short because they were intended to go into the subway, which the original subway had very sharp curves. So these cars were intended to operate in the subway. So that's kind of the story on the cars. So any Clevelander who knows West Park knows Commander Ray. So I had to throw Commander Ray in there. There was a jingle that we heard on the radio every day. I won't sing it for you because I'm not a good singer, but it was West Park, see Commander Ray at West Park Chevrolet. So West Park Chevrolet was directly adjacent to the CTS West Park parking lot. So it was kind of cool. I just thought I would throw that in. So when we get done, basically, we've got the West Park to Windermere rapid transit that lasted quite a few years until 1968. So another 9 years before we saw any kind of extension of rapid transit service. They were very proud in the 5th year of service. They put special material out, promotional stuff, talking about the 75 million riders they carry during that 5-year period. They actually had the highest day of rapid transit ridership, 85,000, in 1959 after the West Park extension opened. Of course, as I mentioned before, there weren't any freeways from this part of town. And if you worked downtown, you had a long drive and a tough time finding parking as well on top of that. So Don Hyde, again, who was the general manager, Don Hyde was just a diehard proponent all his entire career, including when he retired in his consulting career. He was just a diehard rapid transit proponent, subway proponent. Unfortunately, I never met the guy. My dad knew him. I know Bill met him. I understand he was quite a nice guy, but he was very sincere about running just a really first-class operation, which CTS was. CTS was a very first-class transit operation, and was just really, really adamant about the possibilities in the future that rapid transit extension would bring to Cleveland, which it would have had it happened. So this is part of the promotional brochure. And one thing that's kind of the Cleveland pioneer was really the kiss and ride, making kiss and ride easy. So other systems had kiss and ride, but Cleveland stations dedicated lanes near the station access point dedicated to kiss and ride for folks who are dropping people off. So that was kind of unique. And that's kind of what this picture shows with, dad going to work, very traditional family life back then, and mom with the baby taking the car back home to do her chores. So this is kind of, was kind of a unique aspect of CTS Rapid Transit. So fan trips, just kind of talking about a few fan trips. So this one always kills me. I can't imagine in this day and age being able to take a piece of work equipment like a differential dump car, putting wood slats in to sit on for benches, and letting people ride on your rapid transit line. I just think of the liability. As the COO of a big system, I would just I would scream if anybody ever asked to do something like this in today's age. They would just be impossible. So they had a lot of unique fan trips. Another one here, this is another picture from Bill. This was a CTS line car, which was actually a former 1200 series center entrance car that was converted to a line car. The shop did a beautiful job with this. So this was also taken out for a rail fan trip. It's kind of neat. So we'll talk a little bit about the trackless trolley system. So when the modernization plan, the original modernization plan was rejected, the Reed-McCarter plan, which included a large streetcar subway, not just downtown, but about 100 blocks east and west of downtown to get the streetcars out of heavy traffic. When that was rejected, basically trolley buses wound up replacing streetcars on a lot of the routes that were intended to retain streetcars. So that's where the big trolley bus system came. So Cleveland had already been running trolley buses on only one line, that was the Huff line. But starting in the late 40s, trolley bus expansion really took off, mid to late 40s in Cleveland. So they wound up with a total fleet of 461 coaches from 5 different builders on 15 routes. Unfortunately, the West Side routes were abandoned in 1958. We'll talk about that. That was sort of kind of part of rapid transit expansion and building some new facilities. The East Side routes hung on until 1963. So the old Woodhill, as opposed to the new Woodhill, Superior, Denison, and Madison stations were closed. The newest buses were newest trackless trolleys were 50 Mormon Harrington 1951 coaches. A majority of the coaches were kind of bought in that 47-48 period. So these were new trolley coaches when the system was abandoned in 1963. Unfortunately, none of those 1951 coaches were bought secondhand by anybody, which really surprises me because they were just beautiful trolley coaches. So one thing that's really difficult to find with Cleveland is decent color photographs of trolley buses. And I've been searching for pictures of trolley buses, either black and white or color, from any source that I can get my hands on. It's very difficult to find anything. And Jeff Marnoff, who are probably a lot of people who are on this Zoom conference may know Jeff. Jeff's a big New Jersey Transit fan. He's not just a fan of New Jersey Transit. I think he lives in Atlantic City. But he's a fan of all transit across North America. And he has a huge collection. So I've been on Jeff's kind of email list. He probably does a couple a week on different topics for several years now. So I asked him if he had anything color or not of CTS trolley coaches, and he did. And he was kind enough to loan them to me for this presentation. He just wanted me to make sure to mention him and give him credit for what's in his collection. So here we see a 1948 St. Louis trackless trolley. Actually, these are both St. Louis trackless trolleys, different paint jobs. Public Square in 1960. Here we see a 1951 Mormon Harrington in this light blue color, which to me, I just never really cared for that, but kind of a weird paint job. At Woodhill Car House in 1960, It's sporting a PCC car roll sign where you see West 25th with car house underlined. The orange underline in Cleveland meant that it was a short term, that it wasn't going to run the full route. Here we see 1951 Mormon Harrington at Quebec Loop in 1960. Here we see St. Louis, 1948, Anna Mormon, 1951, at East 152nd and St. Clair in 1960. Here's a 1947 St. Louis trackless trolley. You can see the terminal tower in the background at East 12th and Scoville in May of 1960 in the lighter blue paint job. We see a 1948 St. Louis trackless trolley downtown, running the corner right off of Public Square in 1960 again. One interesting thing, and I didn't realize this until Jeff sent me the pictures, and I went back and took a look in Blaine Hayes and Jim Tillman's books, was that this bus, 1324, was actually sent to Brussels for an automotive show in 1952, because it was just such a strikingly, beautiful transit design for a trolley bus. I mean, I always thought the Marmons were really fantastic looking trackless trolleys. And they were so impressed by these things that they actually shipped one over to an automotive car show to display it. And then it came on back to Cleveland. So 1963 was a bad year for trolleybus fans. This is another picture by Bill Vigris. This was on a fan trip using Pullman 874 1948 Pullman product. And we also see the fan trip again on Union Avenue, photo by Bill Vigris. This area was a heavy industrial area. You can see from the oil tanks in the background, storage of lubricants and oils. Union Avenue was a heavy industrial district, not too far outside downtown. Oddly enough, this bus 874 is at Illinois Railway Museum today. It's been a short stint in Chicago. The guys who bought it actually talked the Chicago CTA into letting them run a Cleveland trolley bus on the Chicago system, which was pretty amazing. But we kind of head towards the end of the era. This is Denison Station, which was closed in 859 because of the new Triscuit Rapid Station, new Triscuit garage being built adjacent to the new Triscuit Rapid Transit Station. So you can see in here a lot of trackless trolleys parked in here. There were 4 trackless trolley routes that ran out of here. So this was shut down. Madison Car House was shut down. Trackless trolleys, West Side trackless trolleys also operated out of Madison. This was probably the only PCC car that ever ran down the Madison Avenue streetcar line. And this was on the last PCC car fan trip in 1953. Jim Spangler took this picture. So this facility here was a Cleveland City Railway facility built at the turn of the century. This was part of Hannah's Little what they call the Little Consolidated System. So this is the Triscuit garage. So when Denison closed and Madison closed, I guess the thought of CTS at the time was to put all that deadhead wire up to get off of the routes that were running on the west side over to Triscuit. Probably would have been incredibly expensive. And I guess they just felt like it didn't make any sense to do so. Although those were heavy ridership lines, and that continue to be heavy ridership lines at the west side. So I actually took this picture. I was telling Kristen when we were going over some of this. This was the first picture I ever took as a kid. I was 10 years old. And it's actually of a bus, which is kind of a little sad for a train guy. But after we left Triscuit, we went and took some pictures of the rapid transit. So I guess I redeemed myself. So CTS buses, CTS really in earnest started acquiring a really large system of of really nice buses, good equipment, and very well maintained equipment. So here we see a 1954 GM, really kind of a sharp looking bus as far as buses go. And this is right on Euclid Avenue, when Euclid Avenue was a big deal. It remains so actually into the 70s. The Bond building is on the right, which you really can't see much, but the Bond building is just a beautiful Art Deco piece of architecture. So then we got into the New Look era, and Cleveland bought 100 New Look buses here in 1959. These were the first air-conditioned buses that Cleveland ever purchased. This image here is actually out of the 1959 annual report from CTS. Cleveland was the second system to get New Look buses, the first system being Washington, D.C. Cleveland was the second, and they bought 100 of them. So one interesting thing we'll see as we go through the presentation is transit agencies back in this era, part of their normal budget process was to have an equipment replacement fund. So they actually put money aside every year for the purchase of new buses or trains, streetcars, whatever. So they would always have this cash reserve ready to go to purchase new equipment. Systems do not do that any longer. And I can tell you from being the COO of a big system, you had a bag on your hands and knees to buy new equipment to get into the capital budget for any given year, which is really kind of a crazy way to do business, but that's the way we do it now. So Cleveland really ran a tight ship on buses. They were a 7-time winner of the Fleet Owner Maintenance Efficiency Award in the 50s and into the 60s. This is a flexible bus. Cleveland tried to balance their bus procurements between General Motors and Flexible to kind of keep them both honest and faithful and kind of keep them as good partners, which I thought was a smart thing to do. Cleveland had a good, again, because of the equipment replacement fund, Cleveland had was always kind of periodically purchasing smaller fleets of buses, 50 years, 60 years, 25 years, and then switching between GM and Flexible to keep the average age of the bus at a decent age in terms of maintenance and replacement, which is something we have lost focus on in transit business, I can tell you, because now we go out and we buy 250 or 300 buses at a whack, like we did in Atlanta. And if you have a bad bus, you've got 200 or 300 bad buses that have big problems that are really hurting your service delivery because they're parked against a wall in a maintenance facility somewhere. So we kind of lost this practice along the line. So here's a 1959 fishbowl, part of that original Modern Air, they called them, purchase. This is running on the east side at Buckheim Woodhill Road. Another GM 1967 New Look at a rapid transit station. I'm not sure which rapid station this is. Someone can probably tell me at some point. They went to this, what I thought was a really pretty blue paint job. San Diego had a paint job almost identical to this. But I really always liked this blue. So CTS did a big charter service, like a lot of municipally owned, county-owned bus systems did years ago. So they ran trips to Cedar Point, the orchestra. They had fall leaf tours. They went to the Amish country. They had senior citizens tours that my grandmother used to go on. It was really a big deal, and they made a lot of money on it because you have a lot of equipment sitting around, particularly on the weekends, that you don't need. So if you can put it into productive use and make some money on it, it's like a smart thing to do. And I think it was. They had a great business. They actually had two 1969 Flexibles that they called their charter chiefs. They were built with full kitchens and tables and a bar. Really, really beautiful buses. In the FTA era, this kind of stopped. We really couldn't do much charter service at all. The thought being, if we bought you the equipment, the federal government, you shouldn't be competing against private sector companies who have to bear all that burden on their own, which kind of makes sense in a way. So, if we ever wanted to do any kind of charter, for instance, at MARTA, it had to be like an elected official. That was okay. Or if the local charter bus companies had no capacity to run charters, then we were allowed to do a charter. Sorry about that. So this is a picture older than 1955, but this just kind of shows the amount of service that CTS used to put out to Indians and Browns. This is the old municipal stadium. The new stadium is basically in the same location here, but CTS used to put out a tremendous amount of service to games. And what they used to do, and I used to ride them when I was a kid, was they would run buses down the regular routes, excuse me, say Madison Avenue or Detroit and Lakewood where I lived. And rather than heading into downtown on their normal routes, they would typically go on the Shoreway. And they would run down the freeway to the stadium, and they would divert their routes to service the sports facility. So, and this was from all over the city. This was the east side, west side. I mean, it was really a unique service. Stops were identified where you got these buses, and they were there waiting for you when the game let out. So it was really, it was a great service to the community. There were some early consolidation efforts by Cleveland Transit System. So Cleveland, prior to 1975, bought Lakewood Rapid Transit. This is a picture of a bus at the Lakewood Rapid Transit bus garage, which is actually still standing today. They bought Broadview Bus Line in 1961, Rutherford Bus 1964, and then the Berea Bus Line in 1968. So I thought in my mind, thinking from today's perspective, why would you operate outside your service district? Because these were all outside the city of Cleveland, although CTS was already running outside the city of Cleveland. But why would you buy other bus systems and take the burden on of operating these things? Like, we wouldn't do that, right? Because their bus system, any transit system is basically a loser. You're going to subsidize these things. So in order for us to operate outside of our service district, you have to pay the full burden of the cost of that service. Well, back then, these systems were actually either making money or breaking even. So they weren't creating a new burden for CTS. It just avoided duplication of service to them. They could better integrate the bus service into their current bus lines. And they may not have made any money, but they weren't going to lose a lot of money either. So it was kind of a safe bet to expand the outreach of CTS to make these acquisitions. So it's kind of a different perspective than what we live with today in the modern transit era. So the big thing everybody wants to talk about when we talk about Cleveland is the downtown Cleveland subway battle. That was huge. It was a big decision. It was a decision that kind of altered the course of Cleveland and its development for years, even up until now. The lack of the downtown subway never really made the Rapid what the Rapid could have been, because the Rapid was surviving just on one temporary station at Cleveland Union Terminal, which for a big city, because again, Cleveland was like the 7th largest city at the time, to build this wonderful rapid transit and dump everybody off at one station who had to walk through that station to get to a bus to go where you wanted to go, downtown to your final destination, just didn't make a lot of sense then. It doesn't make a lot of sense now. So the voters approved a subway bond issue in 1953, really before the Rapid started running, because the Rapid started in 1955. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, obviously, for the Rapid, even before the Rapid opened. And it made a lot of sense to build this downtown distribution subway. So the quote on the bottom is kind of, I think, indicative of Porter. We'll get onto him and what other folks thought there. No one goes there anymore being downtown. It's too crowded. Well, it was. So when you took the streetcars out, the idea was, that all these lanes would just free up for traffic. It'd be great to get these surface vehicles off, but you didn't get the surface vehicles off because you built a Rapid without a downtown distribution system. And all those surface vehicles that you were running still came into downtown. They still came into public square, and the congestion was just unbelievable. So the business community, development community, the riding patrons, the politicians, everybody was really, saying, let's get this subway off the ground. Let's build this subway. Let's get these, buses and trolley buses and traffic out of downtown, this huge parking problem we have, and start expanding the rapid transit. The first thing being, let's get the subway built. So we go back to Albert Porter. He's kind of the villain of our story. He was the county engineer from 1947-76. He really built the county's freeway system. He was an ardent opponent of rail transit. And he was also the chairman of the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party, which made him a pretty powerful guy in his day. The opposition was Don Hyde. We mentioned Don Hyde a little bit. He was CTS general manager from 1947-1966. He became a public transit consultant after he retired. And he was just a super strong rapid transit and subway proponent. This guy was really passionate about the role of transit, and particularly rail transit in Cleveland, and not just in Cleveland, but he also spoke about rail rapid transit at committee meetings across the United States, transit conferences. And he was just really dedicated to this idea of a rapid transit system and what it could bring and what it could do for a modern system. So the guy really brought a lot of talent and dedication to Cleveland. Unfortunately, he never saw his vision get off the ground. But the ideas he had were good. They were strong. So here's the original subway plan. This is a 1953 proposal that was approved and adopted when the citizens voted for the subway. You could see the sharp curves, the sharp junctions, tight radius curves. They kind of made the rapid transit cars they were originally bought, the Bluebirds, made them very adaptable to subway use, which is why they were designed the way they were designed. Another alternative subway plan other than just the downtown. So we see the downtown loop here. Another complement to that plan was to move the CTS Rapid, which ran in this joint area with Shaker, to Euclid Avenue as a subway, and then back over to the existing system out to Windermere. This would have been just a super winner because the Euclid corridor, you have Chester up here, you have Cedar Avenue, just a huge watershed of ridership that was totally missed by the rapid transit because it stayed within the CUT right-of-way shared with Shaker Rapid. A cheap way to build it, but not the greatest for ridership. And you see a lot of light rail systems. I worked at DART for a lot of years. We did the same thing. San Diego did the same thing. A lot of these systems stuck to railroad right away because it was a lot cheaper to be in railroad corridor right away than try to carve out a right of way in a dense urban environment. So a lot of ridership was lost because of that. This plan would have rectified that. It would have been really neat if this would have went forward, but it would have been great if just we got the subway downtown. So there was another of the many Cleveland subway studies done in 1955 by Prager, Lighting, and DeLue. Again, we see Charles DeLue raise his head in Cleveland. And the study concerned the operation and feasibility of downtown subway. So we've got some neat renderings in here. This is a rendering of a station, a stacked, we would call today a stacked subway station, East 13th and Euclid Avenue. Here's a rendering of a station at East 9th and Huron Road. We go back to the side-to-side cut and cover style station. East 9th was an incredibly busy street, and it remained one of the busiest intersections actually in the United States. Not just Ohio, until the 70s. It was just incredible. So Albert Porter, in his wisdom, decided, the voters voted on it. Hey, that's great. But, I think we need to check this again. So, of course, we did the study. And he decided we're going to do this survey. So we're going to send all these people out onto the bus system, onto the rapid transit system, and we're going to survey them and see what the subway thing is all about, and would it make sense and would people use it. So they use a lot of Case Tech, which became Case Western eventually, students to administer the survey. So they went out and they rode buses and they rode trains. I'm not sure what the results of the survey ever were, but I think in Porter's mind, it probably was, we don't want the subway. So this culminated in a vote of the county commissioners December 16th, 1959. It was at the very end of the bond issue, so they didn't move forward to spend the money from the bond issue. It was approved in 1953. The bond issue was going to expire, so they had to hurry up and make a decision. This unfortunate guy in the middle here, Commissioner Gorman, was new on the Cuyahoga County Commission. The person to the left had been on the commission for a while. He was Republican. He was against the subway. The person on the right with his head in his hand, William Day, was a Democrat who was in favor of the subway. So it was up to this poor guy in the middle to make a decision on whether Cleveland was going to build a subway or not. The reason I mentioned the political parties is really because, again, Porter was the chairman of the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party. I'm sure he must have had some influence on this young man's future into talking to him into what was the right thing to do for the city of Cleveland. So this is when the hopes of the subway basically were gone for the city. And reading in newspaper accounts, reading in CTS annual reports, the transit agency, the transit board, and particularly Don High, took this decision really bad. It really hurt them. The subway was supported by all the major, what we would call media outlets of the day, the newspapers, the radio stations, Chamber of Commerce, Women's League of Voters. I mean, the business community, everybody was really resoundingly behind the subway, but Albert Porter was able to finagle his way out of it through these kind of fake surveys and really putting a strong arm on a young commissioner. Anyway, that's my opinion. So the subway was gone. So what we were left with, we were left back with the loop bus system. So again, you took the Rapid, you got dumped off downtown. You had a great travel time savings on the Rapid, going from east side to west side, any which way to downtown. But then you had to get off, make your way up a bunch of different ramps up to the surface, get on a loop bus, and make it to your final destination. So these, you can imagine that a 6-car train of Bluebirds coming into the terminal fully loaded in rush hour. And the loop bus activity in rush hour coming through the front of Public Square, coming through the front of the terminal, which is where this bus is right now. It was just phenomenal. I mean, when I was a checker, you couldn't check quick enough to count riders on a loop bus. I mean, it was just an impossible task. You know, obviously, you know, one bus only holds 40, 50 people, and you got a train that's letting off 400 people. So they were just packed. And they used to load them in the back door. They used to have starters with small little fare boxes, taking your transfer, your fares, just packing folks in these buses and getting them out as quick as they could in front of the terminal. It was quite a scene. So now we look at the subway being gone, but, you know, we still got rapid transit expansion to look at, right? I mean, there's still phenomenal corridors. I mean, Cleveland was really well situated for a really big time transit expansion because Cleveland was a big railroad town. There was a lot of available right of way that would have made the thing just really phenomenal. I mean, it was positioned in a really great spot for rapid transit expansion. So what you see with these dashed lines is were the plans for building out the CTS rapid transit. So we have west side extensions, we've got south side extension, east extensions. And the funny thing is, if you took this map and you overlaid it on top of the Van Swergen rapid transit plan or the interurbans that ran into Cleveland Union Terminal, you would find that it matched up pretty well. So a lot of these routes, this route down here was kind of the Northern Ohio. Lakeshore ran out in this general direction, although they were more along the lake, but kind of Lakeshore route, Cleveland, Columbus, and Southwestern, down to Berea. So it just shows you how relevant those old interurban routes really were and still are, because the freeway system got built along a lot of this as well. So this was the plan. So again, we decided, we got to do this 1955 study. We got to be scientific about our research and data accumulation now, and really, take a solid look at it. And actually, this plan was a solid plan. It was pretty much ignored by the county and Porter, and particularly selected parts of this that related to the rapid transit network. So now we're into the modern era of data collection. So this really kills me. So we've got punch cards, which still were in existence when I was going to university in 78, 79. I graduated. We were still using punch cards, which kind of amazes me. But we had a computer back here in 1955. So this is really modern technology for analyzing data. And of course, we had this really pretty lady who did all these collection functions, which really made it, that much better. So this was a scientific method. It was actually a good method. The results were quite good. I've read through the report. The analysis was well done. Being from a planning background, they did a good job. It was well done. One of the conclusions of the report, this really kills me when I read it, is that the proposed rapid transit system and the freeway system complemented each other and could provide a very well-balanced transportation system for the Cleveland metropolitan area, which is what Don Hyde and others had been advocating for many years, that they could coexist together, that it was a smart infrastructure and investment. They were complementary. The transit definitely during peak periods of time coming in and out of the city could really take the loads off the highways. And you see, towards the bottom here, their anticipation of 65,000 daily passenger trips to downtown being diverted from autos to the rapid transit system. And even as the highway system was being built out in 1975, there'd still be some 54,000 some odd automobile trips eliminated from the freeway. So, and this is very much, if you think about McCarter, you think about Chicago, you think about Dan Ryan, you think about those complementary, freeway transit infrastructure projects. You can even look at modern ones like Denver, their build out of their system, following freeway right-of-ways is still doing quite well. Los Angeles. So they had the right idea, but they had the wrong people to implement it. So this is the original 1944 freeway plan, and the vision of the original interstate system was not to penetrate urban cores of cities, but to kind of go around them. And then, if the cities or counties wanted to do something different, that was really kind of up to them. But the big investment was to get the freeway to your region. You kind of took it from there. So the 1955 plan morphed that 1944 plan into all these different freeway plans, just all over the region, just interlaced with freeways. A lot of this stuff was going through major population centers, big time. Here on the east side, here on the west side through Lakewood. You're talking about big neighborhood disruption and destruction, which is really what happened with the freeway system. So unfortunately, all the west side stuff got built. We'll talk about that later. Really destroying the west side, the lower west side of Cleveland really got destroyed by freeway construction. And kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was what you see in red here, which is the Heights Freeway, the Clark Freeway, which was an extension of 490. Some of this was already built in place. This was already built in place, and the Lee Freeway. So the stuff you see in red here would have cut up Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, University Circle, some of the nicest communities, some of the most expensive housing, single-family housing in the entire region, if not the state. So when this came out in the 1955 plan, it just created a community uproar. It was just a phenomenal uproar of the community. And a lot of the community had already seen what was going on the west side and how freeway construction on the lower west side just cut up that neighborhood. I mean, it just obliterated. That was my dad's neighborhood. My grandmother still lived there. It just really tore their neighborhood to shreds. So this is kind of a capsule version of what the plan indicated in those red lines. So you see the Heights Freeway, the Clark Freeway, and you see the Lee Freeway running north and south. So this is going through some really beautiful areas: Fairmount Boulevard, Mayfield Road, Shaker Heights here. This is the Van Aken line, the Shaker Boulevard line. Just really would have decimated the east side of Cleveland. One of the alternatives would have actually put the freeway. This is the Shaker Heights Rapid Transit right away in the center here. They would have paved lanes on either side and widened this. This is St. Luke's Hospital over here. So they would actually put the freeway right into the Shaker Heights right away, which would kind of been unbelievable. And this is one thing that really brought the community into an uproar. So this is what Albert Porter called the Little Duck Pond. So Shaker Heights has this beautiful chain of lakes in the Shaker Heights area called the Shaker Lakes. This is one of them. This is called Horseshoe Lake. So believe it or not, a freeway was supposed to have gone right through this area and just decimated this beautiful wildlife, this beautiful setting, this parkland. And that really caused people to organize, to basically say, you know, enough's enough. So here's a cartoon out of the suburban paper, the Sun Press, basically saying, you know, the cars is our master, the tin god, and we got to regulate this thing because it's becoming unregulated and it's destroying. You can see in the bottom homes and property, landscaping of parks and lakes. So it's really harming our community. So what really changed things for all that East Side Freeway expansion is we got a new mayor, Carl Stokes. He was a sharp guy. Carl Stokes was a Cleveland native. He was a product of Cleveland. He was a poor kid. He grew up on the East Side. He grew up in the projects. He dropped out of high school when he was a young guy to go to work to help support the family, joined the Army, and he eventually got a law degree and became a fairly well-educated guy. The interesting thing is at the time, in 1967, the city of Cleveland was only 38% black, so it wasn't that there was a black majority population that put him in office. He had to form a coalition of a lot of ethnic folks from that were Slovaks and Hungarians and Czechs, and you know, Cleveland was a big ethnic community of these Central and Eastern European communities, and he had to form an alliance with the business community. So he got a tremendous amount of support from the business community, and was, you know, was the father of a couple of young kids, well-educated guy, good-looking guy. He was a smooth guy. He could handle the media. He was a very good communicator. And he really had a vision for Cleveland, really focused on neighborhoods, not so much focused on downtown, although I think he understood the critical nature of downtown. But downtown at the time was fairly solid. The neighborhoods were really starting to deteriorate. And he really had a vision for that. He hired a phenomenal cabinet of people to work in his administration. And they weren't just Clevelanders, they were people who came from New York City and all over the country to help Mayor Stokes figure out how to revitalize the city of Cleveland, which was really headed into some very hard times. So he had some really brilliant talent that he brought to the table. And one of the guys he brought to the table was Norm Krumholtz. Norm Krumholtz was the city planning director from 69 to 79. So he went through successive mayoral administrations, not just the Stokes administration. He went into the Perks administration and beyond. He was a professor at Cleveland State, but after I had left and graduated. But he was really into this concept of equity planning, which when you think back in the 1960s, that's really kind of a radical concept of having equity planning. So his big thing was urban renewal. If those of you that are old enough to remember, urban renewal programs of the late 60s were tearing down huge parts of downtown and inner city neighborhoods to build big buildings, big parking lots, developments that didn't necessarily really help the neighborhood, but benefited business folks and developers who were important to the region for sure, but to the detriment of the neighborhoods. So he was very much against the freeway system slicing and dicing up the east side of Cleveland, not just the suburban area, but it was going to slice up the inner city Cleveland neighborhoods to get to the suburban areas of the Heights and the Lee Freeway and the Heights Freeway. So he was a part of the brain trust, I guess, that kind of started putting the brakes on the county's freeway development project. The other guy who was instrumental in killing the East Side Freeway network was Paul Jones. Paul Jones started with the Van Swergens. He was an engineer in 1932. There was pictures of him on opening day and the terminal, standing in front of the 1200 car with the vans in front of the terminal when they opened up the line into the terminal. He was Shaker Heights Director of Transportation in 1944. He became the mayor of Shaker Heights in 1961 to 73. Obviously, he didn't want to see his city, which is really beautiful, even this is a beautiful city even today, just get sliced up by this huge freeway network. So go back to this guy. So this kind of culminated in a group, a local grassroots group of women. They were in Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights, who kind of banded together to save Shaker Lakes and the parks and keep them from being destroyed by freeway expansion. So obviously Paul Jones was a big part of that because he was the mayor of Shaker Heights, and they would have just have totally annihilated his community and just sliced it up like it had done to the west side of Cleveland. We'll talk about this later, but freeway expansion from the 1955 plan did occur on the west side. People started seeing the decimation of neighborhoods, of inner city neighborhoods, like the first one I grew up in. I grew up on West Boulevard. Our neighborhood was just obliterated by the freeway, cut in half. It just really messed up a neighborhood of really kind of lower class, working class people that had a lot of pride in their neighborhood. They were taking care of their homes. They had decent schools. They were hanging in there. That was a big blow to them when the freeway system came through on the west side. So the governor also swung into action. Governor James Rhodes, we used to call him Rhodes because he built a lot of highway expansion in the state of Ohio. That's one of his big things. He served 4 terms as governor. Now, he wasn't really opposed to the freeway system. He wasn't an opponent of our buddy Porter. He supported most of his activities. But what he wanted to do was he wanted to give votes. And he was running for governor. And there were a lot of wealthy Republicans. He's a Republican living in Shaker Heights area, Cleveland Heights. He needed those votes. So he kind of turned his heels on freeway expansion, decided that, well, maybe that wasn't the greatest idea. So he kind of added some additional opposition to the grassroots kind of community people and the mayor of Shaker Heights and Carl Stokes, the mayor of Cleveland, and said, I think you're right. We should be, cutting up the east side of Cleveland, although nothing did anything to prevent cutting up the west side, which is another story. But so eventually, this is what the freeway network looked like in Cleveland. So you can see on the east side here, you see there's no blue freeways dissecting anything over here where you say East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, Shaker Heights, Beechwood, Warrensville Heights. You see 480 and 270 going around, 90 going around the top, but you don't see anything in that area. Take a look on the left side, which is the west side of Cleveland side. So these are the neighborhoods. I lived here in Lakewood. I originally lived down here right here close to Denison. So we were one of the first areas to be just, really cut up by the freeway. And of course, 77 through here, Brooklyn Heights, Newburgh Heights, these freeways, this freeway here in particular wiped out my grandmother's house, pretty much destroyed your community, came through and destroyed my old community along West Boulevard. And eventually we wound up living with when we moved to Lakewood. So my parents had a really tough decision to leave the city of Cleveland, which is where I grew up originally. We had a great church, a great school, a safe neighborhood. We had shops and stores and bakeries. We had really good transit. We could get to the rapid transit. We had Lorraine Avenue trolley buses, very transit-rich environment. But they could kind of see the writing on the wall that we were going to have a lot of issues with this freeway and this neighborhood just kind of slowly declining. And so my dad, being a motorman on Shaker Rapid, didn't want to move too far away. He wanted to get close enough so he could ride the CTS Rapid to get back and forth to work. That's how we wound up in Lakewood. And of course, the realtor assured my parents the freeway was not going to be anywhere near where we were buying our house, because they were going to push it into Cleveland and it wouldn't touch Lakewood. Well, it turned out that the freeway was built and it's about 6 or 7 houses away from the house that I grew up in. Lakewood insisted that this part of the freeway be depressed. It was not at grade, so it wasn't as visible as it was when it came through the lower west side of Cleveland. But nonetheless, it got built. So we were definitely affected by freeway expansion. So during this period of time, there were plans that were put together by CTS in 1960, 1962, 1963, and they basically went nowhere because essentially there was no funding. Up to this point, which is kind of unbelievable to me, the rapid transit Windermere line to West Park line had been funded by issuing bonds, which were pledged against revenue generated out of the fare box, if you can believe it or not. And of course, there was government assistance through the RFC, some additional assistance here and there, but essentially the taxpayers didn't pay anything for the existing rapid from Windermere to West Park, which Don Hyde often, used as a real positive for look how far we were able to go with very limited funds, and look at the system you already got. Look at the ridership you already get out of the system. It's been a huge benefit for the city. Let's keep going. Let's build the subway. Let's build this rapid transit expansion program. Before we go on to the rapid transit expansion, there are some big news, some big items that happened in Cleveland at the time. Cleveland used to call itself the best location in the nation because from an industrial perspective, you had the Great Lakes, you had a phenomenal railroad system, you had a really good labor pool, you had a lot of skilled workers, tool and die makers, all kinds of skill levels, a lot of automobile production, a lot of steel production. And unfortunately, it started falling on the harder times, and we started getting the moniker of the mistake on the lake, which I always hated. But there were events that kind of made the city look pretty bad. The first one was the Huff riots. Like a lot of cities during this period, there was a lot of unrest in inner city neighborhoods. And Cleveland suffered from that as well. So first riots were the Huff riots. This happened before Stokes got into office as mayor. This was Mayor Loker that went through this. So we had 4 dead, 50 injured, 273 arrested. It was just a phenomenal experience for the whole Cleveland region because no one had ever seen anything like this before. It scared the hell of a lot of people to go through this. They were really concerned that this violence was going to spread into their neighborhoods, not just the suburbs, but also the other neighborhoods within Cleveland. Eventually, spread to the suburbs, just civil unrest was just going to be huge, and there'd just be no way to abate this. So that was the first riots, 66. Things kind of settled down until 1968, which was the Glenville riot, which was a 4-hour gun battle that left 7 dead, including 3 police officers and 1 innocent bystander. Stokes was mayor at the time. He was criticized in many ways for not being able to handle the situation correctly. I'm not sure there was much he probably could have done to handle the situation. He was trying to put plans in place, particularly the Cleveland Now program, to address this. But it was a tough period to go through. He had developed this Cleveland Now program, which we'll talk about a little bit, which was formulated by private sector business folks, as well as Norm Krumholtz, city planning, to really move Cleveland's neighborhoods forward. So we'll talk about that briefly. So the Cleveland Now program was a way to start investing in neighborhoods, not just in the downtown area, because the downtown had a lot of development going on, but we were wiping out a lot of inner city neighborhoods. And a lot of inner city neighborhoods had really tough issues, like the Glenville neighborhood and the Huff area. There were very poor schools, poor city services. The police department was segregated at the time. There were 65,000 residents in the Huff area. They were predominantly African Americans. The businesses were still continued to be owned by white folks. So it was just kind of a tinderbox for these kind of things to happen. Stokes could see this because he was an inner city kid. He grew up with this. He realized what was going on in the city. He knew the investments that needed to be made in the city to kind of calm racial conflict down and build a better, vibrant city. And so that's what the Cleveland Now program was about. So it was a public-private partnership, we would call it today. Back then, they didn't say that. The idea was to raise funding for neighborhood development, to raise $1.5 billion over a 10-year period, which was a lot of money back then. $177 were already committed for the first 2 years of the program. And the program was intended to provide youth activities, employment, community centers, health clinics, housing, and economic renewal and revival for Cleveland's inner city. What happened when the Glenville riots happened is it kind of shook the business community and their thoughts on whether Stokes was the right guy. Could he really move his vision forward? Could he really kind of quell this conflict and build a bigger and better Cleveland? So it kind of shook things, but it didn't totally destroy the program, because actually the program was fairly successful. And in fact, funds were still available until 1980. There was a couple $100,000 left that was given back to the community development organization. So there were 4 civic centers built, community centers built. There were a lot of things that were done to credit the mayor. One of the things that slowed things down was in the Glenville riots, this guy, Fred Ahmed Evans, who was an instigator, militant that actually started the gun battle with the Cleveland police, he had received a grant of $6,000 from the Cleveland Now program. So that didn't make the mayor look very good. The other thing that happened during this period, people probably remember this, who never had been to Cleveland or saw Cleveland, is that the Cuyahoga River actually caught on fire in 1969. There was so much pollution from industry. In addition, Cleveland's sewer system was just totally antiquated. It dumped a lot of water into the Cuyahoga River, and they also dumped a lot of water into the lake, to the point that when I was a kid living in our inner city neighborhood, you really couldn't swim at Edgewater anymore because the water was just so polluted that you could no longer just enjoy the lake and actually swim in the lake. So Stokes was the mayor at this time. And he used the media, television, to bring a lot of attention to what was going on with the dumping of pollutants into the river and the lake, and got a lot of attention on Cleveland, and eventually noticed by the federal government. And Cleveland was part of the way for paving the way towards the Clean Water Act in 1972. Although Mayor Stokes never really wanted to see himself. He didn't see himself as an environmentalist. He just wanted to do the right thing for the city. And he was worried that the focus on the environment would kind of detract from the core urban issues in the Cleveland Now program. So eventually there was $100 million bond issue to improve the sewer system of Cleveland, and then eventually PERC. Was a regional water authority that was formed during PERC's administration. So suburbanization continued to be pretty rampant at this stage. The highway system was being built. A lot of plans from CTS staff, but as Blaine Hayes and Thomas' book says, when CTS was making plans, Albert Porter was paving freeways. So, at some point, the idea of all this rapid transit expansion just really was held in abeyance, which is the idea that Porter had. So freeways are being built, suburbanization was occurring, but the downtown core of Cleveland was still the major employer by far in the region and really in the state. It remained vibrant, even though we had a lot of suburbanization. It was still the entertainment center, the shopping center, and the employment center, business center for the state of Ohio, one of the biggest regions in the nation for that kind of activity. So people still worked downtown. They still came downtown. Eventually that changed because we had suburban malls. So people were not just living as a bedroom community in the suburbs. They were shopping in the suburbs. They were providing entertainment opportunities in the suburbs, and there was a big loss of jobs in the 1970s in the urban core of Cleveland. Downtown, however, remained strong through the 70s and the 80s. I mean, even when I was going to school, graduated in '79, downtown was super congested. Buses on Euclid Avenue were just unbelievable, running 90-second headways. It was just amazing. And then what really hurt was we had construction of new employment centers, like I talked, and smaller industries that were in the city, moved out of the city, and kind of the decline happened over a longer term period. The area got geographically bigger, Cuyahoga County, but it was just a lot of sprawl because it got bigger, but there was really no population growth. It was just people moving around within the region, mostly out of the city of Cleveland into the suburban areas. So CTS Rapid Transit Extension, this was the one that got away. And we'll talk about why it got away, why Albert Porter wasn't that interested in it. And we'll kind of see as we go along. So Cleveland did have a bus route that went from downtown to the airport. But you can see it was probably a fairly long and circuitous route because these are a lot of local streets: Triscuit, Berea, Rain Avenue, Rocky River Drive. They went over to the NASA facility, made a loop around Borough Park, went to the airport. So this would be kind of like an all-day trip. It wasn't going to be a trip that a airport commuter, a business person who came into Hopkins, wasn't going to fool around with taking a bus, even though it was called an express bus to get to downtown. A pretty long running time. So the airport expansion program was originally approved by the board in 1960 as part of one of the plans that actually made it to board approval, but there was really no money to build the thing. So again, Don Hyde got very creative, and he got a mix of financing together from $5 million from county bonds, which is kind of unbelievable that Porter let that happen, $800,000 from a city initiative to expand parking that the citizens voted for, $2 million from the equipment replacement fund, which we touched on before. That money kind of came in handy. And they got a $6.7 million grant from HUD because UMPTA and FTA was obviously not around back then. So the housing department was handling transit at the time. So HUD was looking for a demo project connecting a downtown with a airport for economic development, and Cleveland fit the bill. The project eventually increased from 14.5 million to 18.6 million. Those of you who may know Carl Sally, he passed away some years ago, but Carl Sally was the GM of Seattle years ago. He wound up working in Houston. He worked for me as an operator, believe it or not. Carl worked at HUD years ago, and he said we were just looking for places to hand out money because that was why we were created, was to hand out money and give transit systems a boost. So these are pictures of the construction. So again, this is along the Big Four. You can see the Big Four, New York Central to the right. To the left here, you see the initial construction of the rapid transit. You see the towers going up. And you see on the farther left a lot of freight sidings, which remained in place. So basically from West 117th all the way to West Park, the railroad had customers on both sides of the main line that they served in small yards, like you can see on the right. So my dad and I went out because this was close to our house. We used to watch the construction being built, and my dad is standing down here. I'm standing on top of my bridge. My dad is the guy standing down here, and we can see the rapid transit line being built. This is a picture of my dad and I driving spikes. So we asked the track workers if we could drive some spikes. They said sure. They kind of probably thought we were crazy, but they were nice, and they let us go ahead and drive some spikes. So we were working on the railroad, building the rapid transit back in 66 and 67. One unusual thing about rapid transit expansion is when we talked before about coming down the Nickel Plate right away, which became the Norfolk and Western right away, they would not permit any at-grade crossings of any freight rail sidings, no matter how minor the customer might be. They just did not allow it. So CTS had to build all these big concrete humps, these grade separations to get over the top of these sidings, which of course now are no longer used. New York Central had a little bit better attitude about it. This is the end of their freight spur that paralleled the rapid transit from 117th out here to West Park. So you can see this is actually swinging across. You see these diamonds here. So the railroad actually crossed the CTS main line back over to the Big Four on this side. And they actually there were motors that raised the catenary to a higher height when the railroad had to come through because the freight car height was higher than the running wire height of the rapid. So they actually had these electric motors that pull the wire up in the air. Freight train would cross, they would lower the wire, and they would keep going. Unfortunately, the wire raising and lowering didn't always work. So sometimes the rapid had to put the pantograph down and coast through this area. But they had good operators who knew what they were doing back then, so it wasn't a huge issue. So along with the rapid transit extension, there was a purchase of brand new cars. So these are the Pullman Standard Airporters. The airporter name came from a CTS contest where they let the riders and the public name the new cars. So that's where the airporter name came from. So this is a Pullman Standard postcard. This is a Pullman Standard kind of fact sheet on the car. So these cars were 70 feet long, about 10.5 feet wide, which was a big rapid transit car for their day. You think about New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, particularly Market Frankfurt. Line Broad Street was bigger, but there weren't a whole lot of 70-foot, 10.5-foot wide cars back then, except for perhaps Toronto and the Toronto subway. Their cars were about this length and width because they were a fairly modern subway coming online in the 50s. I don't know whether CTS got the hint from that, but when you think about it, future rapid transit construction, I think about WMATA, MARTA, Baltimore, Miami, Los Angeles. They're all pretty much in this car size. So Cleveland kind of pioneered this length of car. Now, of course, this is excluding commuter rail. I'm talking about rapid transit service here. So the cars only had 2 doors per side. They were outside hung, which I always thought was kind of strange. And back when I was riding on a daily basis to get to Cleveland State in very high ridership years, these cars were just totally packed, and not having any door in the middle was just kind of crazy. I'm not sure where that came from. And then also having outside hung doors, they tended to freeze up in the wintertime, getting water that would freeze in door tracks So the supervisors used to run around with rubber mallets so they could bang the doors in the wintertime, both on the bluebirds and the airporters, to get the doors to open and close. These cars were delivered before the airport extension was in place, so they actually put them on the system from West Park to Windermere to kind of break them in, to run them, to test them. My dad and I got to run on test runs on the airports, which was pretty cool. This was a neat advance compared to the St. Louis Bluebird cars. They were very quick accelerating cars. They had a higher top speed, 55 miles an hour. They were comfortable cars, but they were not good cars to maintain. The maintenance guys never really cared for these cars a whole lot. They did have a rail fan seat here in the front, kind of Chicago style. We'll talk about that in a minute. When I saw these big, huge cars, even as a kid, I thought, there's no way these things are ever going to fit the subway. That subway downtown was like gone forever because these cars could never run in tight curves within the subway. But that probably was the case. So they finally fit the car, the right size car, to the railroad style alignment they were running. Oddly enough, strangely enough, I can never imagine this ever happening again in our lifetime. These cars were moved from the Pullman plant in Chicago all the way to Cleveland, to the interchange track, Shaker interchange track, on their own wheels. The box cars had adapter couplers on them so they could couple into the airport couplers. And they made a special move all the way from Chicago Pullman plant to Cleveland. So here we see, this is a picture by Willis Michaela, who was a big rail fan in the Cleveland area, also nickel plate photographer. He took these pictures. So here we see along the rapid, we see one of these big grade separation humps here to the left. This is coming into the parallel to the joint area on the nickel plate. You can see up above the unique catenary towers for the CTS Rapid. And then finally, we see them coming into the Shaker East 32nd Street interchange. So it's pretty neat. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that would ever happen again, but it did back then. Actually, the CTS Bluebirds were delivered at the same interchange, but they were on the top of flat cars. They did not run on their own wheels from St. Louis. So there are neat features on the airport extension, including cab signals. So cab signaling started at West Park and went to the airport. In later years, the whole system was finally cab signals, but this was pretty modern for its day. It included a new control console at the Burke Park substation. And at the bottom, we see this high-tech electronic data links. This was a big deal back then. They also used Corten catenary towers, which was kind of, Corten was the metal of the day. I think those catenary pole foundations are being replaced now. So here's opening day. You can see the lineup of stewardesses. You could actually say stewardess back then. Now we have to say flight attendant. From all these different airlines lined up in front of this banner for the first train to come through. This was in 1968, November. And here we see the train coming on through the banner. So it was a big day. It was a big deal because not only was Cleveland the first system to have direct rapid transit access from downtown to the airport, they were the first system in the Western Hemisphere to ever have train access from a downtown core to the airport. So it was a big deal. It was pretty exciting at the time. So there were a lot of promotional brochures put out. This one was put out by CTS itself, extolling the virtues and the up-and-coming jumbo jets that would be serving the city of Cleveland. This was put out by Republic Steel. I assume perhaps the stainless steel in these cars came from Republic, but I'm not sure. This was a brochure put out by General Electric, kind of touting, because they had GE propulsion on these cars. And even the railfan community, the ERA, even did a whole feature article. Bruce Benty, who I think is still around, wrote this article on the Cleveland subway cars because they were quite a sensation. The airporters were in their day. Here's a nice picture of an airport in service leaving Windermere Station, 1971. Here's a neat picture along the Big Four right-of-way. This train is going into the airport. Here's a neat picture down by the West 98th Street curve where they transition from nickel plate right-of-way to New York Central right-of-way. Detroit Avenue is above us on top. And we got a train of bluebirds running over here. The bluebirds, I forgot to mention, were kind of unique. They had these vents up here for ventilation. They had fans inside the train that were supposed to be old subway or surplus subway, or not subway, purpose submarine fans from World War II to provide ventilation. The interesting thing is, I saw this in some article I was reading, and I remember this as a kid. These cars would ingest snow, and it would start snowing in the inside of the car, which was really interesting to see snow coming into the car when you're riding along at 50 miles an hour. Eventually, they covered up the fans with the fiberglass cover in the wintertime, so that wouldn't happen and the cars would be warmer. So yes, the bluebirds operated to the airport as well as the airporters. We see a picture here, Fulton Avenue curve, 1972. We see a flexible bus up above. And then here's a cool shot of the airporters, two airporters coming in and out of the terminal station, lower level of the terminal. We talked about the rail fan seat before. You can see the rail fan seat here. There's a couple of people sitting here, which was kind of neat until Cleveland got into this rock throwing and debris throwing era where kids would just throw rocks at trains and shopping carts on top of rapid trains off of bridges. And unfortunately, someone threw a big slab of concrete off of the bridge, smashed through this window and killed a couple people that were sitting here. So CTS closed off this area. The cab was always configured just for the operator, and there were bars put across these windows. We'll see in later years. Unfortunate accident. There's a picture at Windermere, 1968, with an airporter. That's when these cars were brand new. Still had some old GM buses around. Cleveland was very good at intermodal, kiss and ride, park and ride, bus transfer. They built a very well integrated system. Unfortunately, there was a lot of complaining from people because they lost their one-seat ride. And the Rapid was always an express fare, so you had to get a transfer, you had to pay an extra fare to get on the Rapid. People missed their one-seat ride to downtown. And slowly but surely, CTS started kind of caving in and allowing a lot of duplicate service. They really kind of diluted the rapid transit's attractiveness. So that did slowly occur. So this was the final system. We see Windermere to the airport. Brook Park was under construction at the time. It opened later. One of the interesting things about the airport extension, this goes back to Albert Porter. Why did Albert Porter not care about the airport extension? Because you already built a freeway. You built I-71, which went to the airport. And that opened before the Rapid opened and really siphoned off a lot of the ridership out of the Rapid because it was much easier to take the freeway than to ride the Rapid downtown, although the ridership was still good. It didn't provide a tremendous amount of new ridership. The extension was from West Park to the airport. It was kind of a marginal increase in ridership because the freeway took a lot of it away, but it did permit at Brook Park Station, people coming off I-71, 480 directly into the station to ride downtown. So there was some of that ridership, and there was a lot of industry along Brook Park Road, a GM plant, Ford engine plant, all kinds of things. It was hard to get to before freeways. So this opened up a lot of opportunities for folks who worked in that area coming from the east side to get access to jobs on the west side along Brook Park Road. So it was positive in that aspect. Although if you wanted to get your car stolen on CTS Rapid, this was the place to park it at Brook Park because it was easy to steal it and get on the freeway and be gone quickly. Purity Station also opened up. This was more of a neighborhood station. My uncle used to walk from his house to Puritas. He was also a shaker operator. It's a great way for him to get back and forth to work. So Not a huge success, but it did okay. So federal money started flowing back in the 60s. Back in 1964, UMTA was created. Part of what UMTA was pushing for was the transit agencies should put together 10-year capital programs, which is something that we do today. They want to have some idea of what kind of capital expenditures were going to be out there with all these transit systems across the U.S. and what could they afford to fund? How could they program their funds? So they pushed hard for 10-year plans, which Cleveland put together. And there was a 1974 plan that was put together. And also in 1971, actually 1969, Cleveland got a $13 million grant from UMTA, which is the first UMTA grant, for the construction of the East 34th Street Campus Street Station and a new rapid transit yard at Brook Park. So originally, this is a nice, just shows you a nice 4-car train of airporters. That was the longest train of airporters that they could run. The Bluebirds were 6-car trains. So CTS Rapid Transit originally bypassed 34th Street. This is a Shaker Rapid stop, these little typical wood green shelters. There was an idea that for people wanting to go, particularly to the airport, to go to the downtown terminal, have to go up and down ramps, particularly Shaker riders and others. It would be attractive to have the station here, plus the Tri-C campus, community college campus, and Cleveland State University was at East 22nd Street, kind of towards the fringes of downtown, a little harder to serve. They extended loop buses over here, and the idea was, let's build this campus station where we can have this transfer activity occur here, not having to go to the downtown terminal to do that. So this is a big deal. This was a car card advertising. This one is actually over at Northern Ohio Railroad Museum, I think in the 1200. So they built this nice platform, built a nice new station. It worked okay for a while. Unfortunately, East 34th Street is not a great neighborhood. People standing here with their luggage were kind of an open target for a lot of people, as were a lot of college students. So there was a lot of mugging, a lot of theft, and it really deterred ridership at the station. It just never quite turned out to be what it needed to be. Interesting thing is, CTS built this nice station, nice new station entrance, but Shaker kept their old style little green shelters. They never built anything really nicer. Shaker kind of pinched every penny to get their hands on. They let Cleveland State and Tri-C students paint buses. They extended the loop bus over to the campus station. A lot of people don't know Cleveland was the first transit system to have AC propulsion cars. It was a project funded by the Department of Transportation, UMTA. It was a joint Westinghouse-Reliant Electric project. There were 3 airporters that were converted. They ran quite successfully. They used Reliant Electric industrial motors. They did well. In this picture, you can kind of see the bars across the window where the rail fan seat used to be. And I think this was converted actually to luggage storage area as well. So that was kind of an interesting project, kind of the first for the industry. Then we had the arrival of the SOAC car. Folks of you who are old enough to remember the SOAC state-of-the-art car, visited Cleveland in 1975. Built by St. Louis, the program was managed by Boeing. The car was based on the New York City R44 car. Let me flip ahead here. The cars ran on 6 rail systems: Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, and eventually PATCO. Cleveland was the only system that actually ran with the pantograph. Everything else was third rail. Each car was set up for different, each car of the married pair was set up with different seating configurations, a low density, high density configuration. The cars ran in Pueblo in 1973. Those of you remember the Pueblo Test Center that was built in the 70s. Unfortunately, there was a tremendous accident in Pueblo with this car. They ran into an open switch, hit a freight car sitting at a siding, and they killed the operator. but they did rebuild the cars. So the cars ran in Cleveland for about 3 days. This was during kind of the Nixon-Ford transition era. So the cars had Garrett chopper propulsion, which was a big advance for its day, kind of an intermediate technology before we got the thyristor control. And there was a mock-up, I didn't realize this until I was reading Blaine's book, there was a mock-up of the SOAC that was displayed at Public Square and Parnatown and Severance. So big deal, operated for a while in Cleveland. I actually got to ride on it with my dad. It was pretty cool. I got to ride in the cab with the operator and the test engineers. It was a lot of fun. So here's some exploded views of SOAC. Here's an artist running a SOAC. And this was the neatest thing I found. I searched and searched and searched for a picture of SOAC operating on the Cleveland system on CTS. I know I took pictures myself, but I could not find them. But I found this one searching around on the internet. And so this shows a SOAC car at Windermere Maintenance Facility in 1975. So now we go on to Shaker Heights Rapid Transit. 1955 to 1975. So 1961 was the 50th anniversary of the city of Shaker Heights, not of the rapid transit as some people think when they see this picture. This was the city's anniversary, so they painted up this car special in this gold and blue paint job that a lot of people thought was pretty attractive. We talked about Paul Jones. He was the guy who originally ran the Shaker system for many years, former advanced Swearingen engineer. And eventually Bob Landgraf took over as a chief engineer and then eventually assistant general manager. And then when Paul Jones retired as mayor in 73, Robert Landgraf became in charge of the general manager of Shaker Heights Rapid Transit. He was an interesting guy. He was a civil engineer. He was part of the advocacy group that stopped the freeway coming in through the Shaker Lakes. And that's how he got Paul Jones' attention. And he asked him to come and join him to run the rapid. He was a very nice guy. I remember him as a kid. He was kind of a very awkward, kind of gangly guy. A lot of times the maintenance away crews would just run him off. He came to show up to tell him how to do things. He was kind of a funny guy, but his heart was in the right place. He did hire Ed Allen on the recommendation of Jerry Brookins from over Trolleyville, who met him in Iowa, to come run the Shaker shops. So Ed was kind of a controversial guy. People either loved him or they hated him, although he was an ardent rail fan, which is kind of interesting. So here we see a kind of a typical lash up, multiple unit PCC cars running on Shaker. We see Pullmans and Minneapolis cars here running together. So that was kind of typical of Shaker's operation, continued to be so. 1959 was the last year for the operation of the 1200s in regular service. So these cars were built by Pullman. In 1914, 1915, they were initially leased by Cleveland Interurban Railroad, which was Advanced Swearingen Enterprise, and eventually the city bought these cars. Shaker Heights did. Unbelievable that a 1914 car is still out there running in 1959. So these went out of service in regular schedule operation. However, they kept 2 5-car trains of 1200s, and they still use them in special event service for football games and other big events because they were just great crowd haulers. They still ran these in the early 60s, 60, 61. They still dragged them out for special events and still operated these cars. Also operating back then were these 300 series cars, which were built by St. Louis. They were ex-Fox River cars. Cleveland had a number of these cars, 6 of these cars, I believe. And they were still operating when the rapid transit opened. There was an agreement with CTS to quit operating these cars because they were very slow. And also it was very hard for them to configure the trucks to put the trip stops on, which was part of the automatic clock signal system. So there was an agreement to not run these. These cars didn't run past 1955. Shaker eventually bought, in 1959, they acquired cars from St. Louis. They were St. Louis built cars, but also from the St. Louis, city of St. Louis, who rebuilt these cars in their own shops and then viewed them. And this was kind of the end for the 1200 operation, basically, except for special events. My dad took these pictures in 1963 when the cars were repainted, and he liked to paint the wheels. The wheel rims right, wheel rims white. I'll get that correct. Like in standard steam locomotive kind of pictures. He enjoyed doing that, so he did that. These were not the bus-like cars by Shaker, either the operators or the mechanics. They weren't the bus-like vehicles. They train lined, but you could always tell if there was a St. Louis car and a lash up of cars, because they just didn't operate very well with their other friends, the Pullmans and the Minneapolis cars. There was a lot of bucking and shaking going on. So fan trips. Here's a center entrance 1200, number 12. This car was preserved. When the revenue service cars went out of service in '59, they were a group of rail fans who worked for Shaker, including my dad and John Balch and Bob Blatt, who approached Mayor Jones to keep a 1200 for charter service, so he agreed to. I'm not sure why they picked car 12, but they did. This is a picture of the car after it was repainted in the original gray and red paint scheme downtown in the terminal. So they parked this car on a weekend, and the rail fan group came out and repainted the car. They also did, actually, this is the car repaint. This is my dad operating number 12 on a fan trip. He was requested often for fan trips because he would give you all kinds of great photo opportunities and stop in all kinds of strange locations on top of bridges and along the joint area and places like that. Because he was a rail fan and he enjoyed it too. So, this is the interior of the 1200 car. You can see the rattan seats. There's a number of these in museums that are still around. They also had a differential dump fan trip. I'm not sure if this is the same one, but kind of interesting that you could do that back then. They also took cars, PCC cars and 1200s out to Windermere, because Windermere had a loop and you could actually turn the car, get it back onto Shaker. And so there's a lot of fun taking these cars out on the CTS Rapid as well. So maintenance. So Shaker ran on a shoestring budget. They never invested a ton of money into the rapid transit. It was a small municipal operation. It was intended to get people into downtown Cleveland as the Van Swarges intended from this development. So used a lot of secondhand materials, secondhand rail, ties, all these things to maintain the system. They had no radios. They used to use crank telephones and telephone boxes. They had no supervisors. They only had motormen. The motor were used to control single tracking sections. They had all hand-thrown switches except for Van Eyck Junction. Very manual railroad. A lot of skilled guys running the railroad because it was manual. Fantastic safety record until RTA took over. So this is what they call the Ox. It was nicknamed the Ox because it worked like an ox. It moved things around. It worked hard like an ox would do. It's a 1924 Coleman product, ex-Eastern Michigan, ex-Northern Ohio. It arrived in Kingsbury shop on its own power from the Northern Ohio in 1932. My dad always said that Shaker never paid for it. It was basically left there as a gift by the Northern Ohio. They stored it in the shop for many years, never actually used it. They had another line car that they used most of the time, 101. It was typically stored in CU2 shop tunnels, CUT, leaving internal shop tunnels during the daytime. It was used for the Santa Claus special, where they brought Santa Claus to Shaker Square every year. My dad always made sure that he made an unadvertised stop at East 79th Street so the poor kids could see Santa too, because my dad grew up as a poor kid. He wanted them to have an opportunity, as well as the folks up in Shaker Heights. I spent a lot of evenings on this car with my dad. It was a lot of fun to go out doing work, which always wound up with a great breakfast, usually cooked by the overhead crew, which were mostly Hungarian guys. They used to cook up a breakfast at Woodhill shop where they hung out. In 1985, this car was moved off the property. Tim O'Donnell and Mark and I rode on this as well as others. It was the last, we call it the last interurban leaving Cleveland Union Terminal because it wasn't interurban. Ed Allen was a motorman. The wire was already done at Kingsbury, so we had to get pushed by a locomotive. We almost lost the car in a grade. That was kind of interesting because it started rolling backwards. Some people spent the night down there at Kingsbury. Took liberty to get some parts off cars that were being scrapped down there. And it was a hell of a time getting it out because it really should have gone out at Brook Park, but Ed Allen was very stubborn. So here's another picture of track work. We see a PCC car single tracking around. And of course, single tracking was done manually. There were no facing point switches, so you had to back switches. There were no frogs in the catenary, so you had to physically move the pole over from one track to another. But they did it, and they did it very safely. This is kind of interesting. These are the differential dump cars. These were HL controlled, so these were actually MU. This is the way Cleveland Railway did it. These cars came off of Cleveland Railway, were kept by CTS during the CTS period. So they were back-to-back MU, and that 1200 that you see, which I think is 27, is also HL control and could also train line with these cars. So it was kind of interesting. They even had, Cleveland Railway even had trailers that they would put in between 2 or 3 trailers where they could actually MU through the trailers to a working motor on either end of the train and run these trains on the streets. Cleveland had Shaker had a couple of disasters in the 60s, 70s. This one, it was a big section of poles that came down. The system was shut down for 5 days. Again, these are the original poles that were installed when the system was built, never upgraded since the 30s. There was another disaster like this in the 70s where a huge section of wire came down because a truck backed up into a pole by accident. So rolling stock, on the rolling stock front, this is when the orange paint job came out. It was the very end of the Shaker era going into the RTA era. This was a big deal. This paint job was picked out by Ed Allen and Bob Landgraf. This is Traction Orange. This picture actually showed up in Traction and Models magazine, for those of you who used to read Traction and Models. This picture actually made it in the magazine. Paint job was really controversial. A lot of people hated it. My uncle Arnold just hated it. He thought it looked like a pumpkin. He loved the yellow. I always loved the yellow. The yellow to me was very traditional. Shaker, it actually came from Cincinnati PCC cars. So they also started putting the City of Shaker Heights Department of Transportation on the cars above the roundel for the rapid transit lines, which was kind of new. So major Shaker news, of course, the Huff riots, they were very concerned that folks were going to start, I don't know, walking down the rapid transit right away to attack people in Shaker Heights or something. I don't know the logic behind that, but people were scared. So the National Guard was here guarding the rapid transit right away, I guess, waiting for the herds of folks coming out to cause violence, to wreak violence. The courthouse and police station was bombed in Shaker Heights in 1970. That was a big event. People thought it was a terrorist activity, but it actually turned out to be a guy who had psychological problems that had previously been arrested by Shaker Heights police. So now we go to the new beginning. And this is kind of orange because that was RTA's colors basically were primarily orange. So how was RTA formed? RTA was really the idea of Ralph Perk, who took over from Carl Stokes. We see them shaking hands here in the bottom of the slide here. He was mayor from 1972 to 1977. He was of Czech origin, which in Cleveland means a lot because there's a lot of Central Eastern Europeans that were still, particularly back then, living in the city. Hungarians and Slovaks and Romanians and all kinds of folks. So you had to kind of get that so-called ethnic vote at the times, we used to call it. Ethnic folks back then were people from Eastern Central European areas. That has taken on a different meaning today than it did back then. But that vote was important to become mayor. That was the same vote that Carl Stokes had to get in order to be mayor as well. So he was kind of seen as, hometown kid. He was one of us. He was a Czech. The guy was a high school dropout. He eventually did get a high school degree. He dropped out to work to support the family. He was on city council for 10 years. He was elected mayor in 1972. And he was the first Republican since the 1940s that became mayor of the city of Cleveland. He was known for his gaffes, kind of like some politicians say stupid things occasionally or do stupid things. Picture on the right and the bottom, he actually caught his hair on fire. That made the national news when he opened up a Society of Metals convention in 1972. He also famously, he was invited to the White House by Nixon to go to dinner. His wife said they couldn't go because it was her bowling night, and the league bowling, was pretty important to her and her team. So that was pretty funny faux pas that made the national news. But actually, I don't think he really liked Nixon that much to begin with, so it may have been more him. He was just an average guy. He was a great guy, really like a person of the people kind of guy. He was very accessible to folks. Folks came up to him on the street, said hello to him. Carl was the same way, very personable guy. I remember meeting Perk in a bar when I was in college, drinking in the flats. He came in after some meeting that he had. He sat down with us. We bought him a drink. He sat and talked with us. And then he actually got on a guy's boat who happened to be tied up at the bar we were drinking at. He got on the boat, took off with him, and told his police detail just to stay there. Don't worry about it. I got this. So he left the police behind, got in this guy's boat he had never met in his life, took his drink with him, and had a great time. So he was an interesting guy, a very down-to-earth guy. He was incredibly passionate about transit. He realized the importance of transit, the vitality of the city of Cleveland. He spent a lot of time riding on buses and trains, talking to people, talking to what we call the babushka grandmas, the grandmas that used to wear the scarves over their head all the time. They were part kind of the ethnic flavor of the city of Cleveland back then. He talked to the average people about transit. What was their vision? What did they see? How important was this to them? What was the future? And, CTS was profitable until 1967. They were actually making money. From 67 to 73 or so, they were breaking even, but they weren't making any money. And then when 73, 74 hit, they actually had a financial crisis. And Perk helped them get out of it. He convinced the city council to loan Cleveland Transit System $6.9 million, or actually $9.6 million, because they were getting ready to actually default on their bonds, which they have floated out there primarily probably for rapid transit expansion and the purchase of equipment. So we helped bail them out. Cleveland was in tough straits back then. Shaker actually lost $400,000 the same year from their, and they had to pay that from their general fund. And transit at the time kind of wound up in this death spiral that a lot of systems went through in the 60s and 70s, where they raised fares, they cut service, they lost ridership, they raised fares, cut service, lost ridership. They kept going around, and Perk was smart enough to see, like, this is not going to last. This is the death spiral. The transit system is too important to the city and the economic vitality of the region. We got to do something. So the RTA was in large part his idea. He had to convince a lot of people to come along with him for the ride. And here's some promotional materials from 1974 about the run up to the election. Pretty neat, but the big thing was they committed lower fares. So fares on express routes, I think, were already up to $1 at the time. So the idea was one of the big incentives was the local fare would drop to 25 cents. And the express fare would go to 35 cents. There'd be no zone fares, and all transfers would be free. And they would do this for a period of, I think, 5 years. Elderly handicaps, folks rode free 20 hours a day. They couldn't ride for free during rush hour. Students rode for half fare. And one of the things that was pointed out, which I thought was kind of interesting, was how much money CTS was losing by not being available to receive federal funds. And they used Atlanta as an example, which is funny because that's where I worked. So they say Atlanta for the last 2 years received $800 million, and we pretty much gave up $150 million. Back then, the federal government also provided operating assistance, so they would defer a large chunk of your operating costs as well. So Cleveland was missing out big time. So I won't go into what happened back then because I'm kind of stopping at 1975, but you realize what happened. It was successful. There was a 1974 10-year plan we talked about, which included downtown subway, West Side Rapid extensions, including I-90 West to Clay Road, extension to Berea, East Side extensions to on the heavy rail side, Depot Heights Boulevard, Shaker Rapid to I-271, which seemed to be a total no-brainer to me because it's only a couple miles. You connected directly into a freeway. Shaker Heights Van Aken line was intended to be extended to Randall Park Mall. So none of these happened. That's the sad thing. Not one of these actually occurred. So again, while they were making plans, the freeway guys were pouring concrete. So it's kind of a shame because even though when RTU was created and federal funding was really at its height, they just never took advantage of it. A lot of that was because of the highway guys. Also, some of that was because of the city of Cleveland planning director, which we talked about before, Norm Krumholtz, was a real opponent of rapid transit expansion because he really felt like it would diminish service in the inner city and would encourage more folks to leave the city. And what it really did was it caused eventually the demise of downtown because it was so hard to get in and out of downtown, caused a lot of suburban development, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the great expansion efforts was to go down I-90 West. Porter's, I call this Porter's last stand because he was still around for a couple more years. What would have happened back here where you see this bridge, this is Triscuit Garage to your left. Here's a train approaching Triscuit Rapid Station. The I-90 freeway kind of cuts across this area through here. You can actually look down from the I-90 freeway. You can see Triscuit Garage from the freeway. So the idea was to come off, here's Lakewood, the CTS Rapid kind of took off here, went down to the airport. They could have made an easy diversion and gone on to I-90 and then taken off to Rocky River and beyond, which was a huge ridership watershed from the west. So obviously the county was against that. The state didn't like the idea. There was a lawsuit that transpired. They built a section of the freeway through Lakewood, which was the closest one to the rapid, where they would have come off the rapid. There was no median left for them to drop down into because they built the freeway without that center median for rapid transit. The lawsuit was successful. This piece of freeway sat here for years. We used to play on the thing. We used to play tennis across the Jersey barriers, not the guardrails in the center of the freeway. We used to ride our bikes down here. We used to do fire firecrackers off and all kinds of stuff down here. It was just a great place for a juvenile delinquent to hang out on the freeway. So eventually the lawsuit prevailed, and there is a rapid transit right-of-way through Rocky River out to the west, and there's a median right-of-way from where the rapid is out to the east. So where you want it, it wasn't there. So that project never really took off. So we say farewell to Shaker and CTS because we know 1975 is on its way. So we got a nice picture of Shaker Rapid car in its orange paint scheme and a nice picture of the CTS airporter in the wintertime. So we got a new year coming up, and that's for another presentation down the road. But as a bonus, since you guys signed up early, we have a bonus that we're willing to offer, which is just outside of this 1975 period. there was an up to downtown people mover program, which Cleveland was successful in winning. So Perk was the one who put the grant in during his administration. There were 5 cities that were selected. Only one of these actually ever built anything, which was Detroit. Cleveland turned the money back. They decided they didn't want it. Here's an idea of what the route would be for the downtown people mover. So this would be typical, sort of like Westinghouse looking cars. This is a rendering of the station downtown. There was a lot of pushback because Cleveland has a lot of beautiful older architecture, and it was thought that this just was really an imposition on the architecture. Again, it was opposed by Norm Krumholtz, city planning director, opposed by Porter and anybody else that could be opposed to it. There wasn't a transit guy. So this died, and the boy mayor, we used to call him, is the youngest mayor of any top 10 city at 32 years old. Dennis Kucinich was left with killing the project. So an added bonus, only for today, we're going to talk about Car 109, which I understand from Scott Becker is now operational at Northern Ohio Railway Museum. Here's a picture that Bill Vigers took of 109 with a subway sign. Kind of unbelievable, the subway that never occurred. So the roll sign, I guess, included subway destination. So Bill took this picture at Windermere, and here we see a picture of the Car 109 over at Northern Ohio Railway Museum in operation. So Tim O'Donnell was working for RTA at the time. He was in charge of this restoration project, so he researched the colors and the decals and all that stuff. Wasn't really sure that it would turn out great until they got it out of the body shop outside in the sunlight, and they saw what a great job they did, so they're very happy with it. This car was on display in the new Tower City station. Ron Tober was GM at the time, really thought this was a neat idea. They were actually thinking about doing additional cars, but they actually never got around to it. So that's the end of my presentation, and I wanted to thank my dad, Bill Vigers, Blaine Hayes, and Jim Tolan, because they're the Cleveland books, Cleveland's Transit Vehicles, and the companion volume, which is Horse Trails to Regional Rails, is just a fantastic resource for anybody interested in Cleveland Transit. James P. Marcus, because I bought so many of these guys' slides off of eBay. I'm not sure who he is. I've asked around. I'm not sure anybody knows him. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he was a great photographer. We got a lot of wonderful color slides in this presentation from James Marcus. And of course, Jim Spangler, who was a big Cleveland rail fan. I used a number of his pictures as well in the presentation. So that's my presentation. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. And I guess we'll start taking some questions now.
Yes, some praise coming in the chat already. And before we get to questions, I did want to let everybody know about a couple things coming up. Our friends at the East Penn Traction Club are hosting the East Penn Traction Meet over in Allentown in May. So if you're interested in that, make sure you check out their website, which is, I have it on here. I've got so many windows up, eastpenn.org. You'll find that on there. And then for us, coming up here at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum on May 3rd, which is in just over 2 weeks, we've got our next Trolleyology from George Gula. It'll be about the McKeesport trolley lines of Pittsburgh Railways. And then at the museum, we have Free Museum Day on May 7th. And there are a couple other, actually 5 or 6 other museums in Washington participating. And June 3rd and 4th, Anything on Wheels, which will feature on that Saturday, a night photo shoot and trolley parade. Thank you guys for coming today. It was wonderful seeing everybody. And if you would like, please make a donation at patrolley.org/support. Thank you to those of you who have already donated for this program during the registration process. We really, really appreciate it. And then we are going to unmute ourselves here in just a minute. But Rich, I did have a question come in. Can you explain again why CTS and Shaker Rapid ran left-hand on the east side from the terminal tower for so many years? This is from Walter Zulik.
Yeah, because the shaker cars only had doors on the right-hand side, typical streetcar. Although the shaker Pullmans had left-hand doors that were intended for subway use, but were never used for the subway. So there were center platforms uh, at East 34th Street, East 55th Street, which the CTS cars could access because they had doors on both sides, but the PCC cars didn't. So that's why they had the left end running, because of the center platforms.
Perfect. And I just changed it so that everyone should be able to unmute themselves. At most people on a computer, that's on the bottom left. So you can just click the little microphone icon there and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask Rich a question directly. Anyone? Lots of nice comments coming in. Everybody was thrilled at how well you covered the whole system. And Richard Allman.
Thanks, Rich. A terrific presentation. A couple things. First of all, Bruce Benty is alive and well, very active. He is, I think, 85 going on 40, still leads hikes through the mountains. Just got back from a round South America trip. The other thing is the Cavs are up 72 to 55. This is a Cleveland night. And about the airporter cars, I rode them a couple times when I was in Cleveland on professional meetings, and I rather liked them at the time. I think you explained that the shop crews weren't happy with them, and I remember a conversation with Ron DeGraw when he was who was a good friend when he was GM at Scepter Red Arrow, when they had to abruptly withdraw the Bullets and Stratford cars from service after a couple horrific accidents, and they were scrounging around for cars, and for cars that specifically might be operated as one-man crew cars. And I had talked to Ron about it, and I think the issue was a width issue more than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, the cars were comfortable. I mean, they had nice, 2x2 seating, air conditioning, good lighting. They rode fairly well. But I guess they just weren't too happy with them. Some of it is, I think, Tim O'Donnell, who was superintendent of equipment maintenance, told me that they kind of ran the wheels off the cars. And when RTA was created, ridership went up like 23%. I mean, it was a huge increase, and they were running the wheels off of everything. And they didn't have enough cars. And of course, that was in the 35-cent fare era, which attracted a lot of people back to transit as well. And I think there was just a lot of deferred maintenance, and those cars were fairly complicated, apparently, to maintain. And when they got the Tokyo fleet, originally they were going to continue to run a mixed fleet of airporters, Tokyo cars, get rid of the St. Louis Bluebirds. But Tokyo offered them a great deal to replace the entire fleet. And the FTA permitted the airporters to be saved as a reserve fleet. But once they parked them as a reserve fleet, they never really moved their wheels again, except when my friend Tim would move them around occasionally to make sure they were still, operable. But yeah, they were not the most liked cars.
What was the ultimate disposition of them?
A couple of them went to museums. I know Norm's got one. There's one down at Ohio Railroad Museum. I think the rest of them were just scrapped.
When you talk about the subway that didn't get built, was that going to be a cut and cover, or how were they proposing to build the subway?
Yeah, it was pretty much cut and cover because the geology of Cleveland permitted. There was no deep bore tunneling required. So it was a fairly cheap subway to build.
I see Paul has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Great presentation as always. Question about the SOAC. What was kind of the objective of running the SOAC? I mean, in Cleveland or anywhere, were there like surveys taken, or was it like research, or was it proof of concept, or what? Do you know kind of like what the objective was?
Yes. Basically, it was to demonstrate like newer advanced rail transit technology. and how it could be applied to a lot of different systems. So it was kind of a test bed for technology, like the Garrett propulsion. The chopper stuff was pretty new for its day. I think the trucks were Rockwell, I think. So they were trying to demonstrate a modern rapid transit vehicle. It was a pretty striking looking car. I mean, it was attractive. And I think it was just, UMTA at the time wanting to kind of, exercise their ability to fund and do research,
It just had a park and brake problem. That's all.
Oh, is that right?
Well, when it rolled out of the Boeing plant across the highway, I remember that day.
Yeah.
Going down the highway, so look at this. It rolled right out of the plant by itself.
Yeah, it was odd because, they fortunately picked St. Louis to build a car, but it was kind of Boeing's entry into the transit side. And of course, when the SLRV program came out, Boeing took that on themselves, research, construction, and everything. And the old school car builders got pushed out slowly, one by one, and killed by New York City eventually.
Any other questions for Rich or comments? Anybody?
Great stuff.
Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Hi, me and Conrad are in the BERA sub shop watching this,
Oh, nice.
and really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you did.
Thank you.
Ask Conrad if he enjoyed the people mover part.
I didn't enjoy it. I loved it. We gotta use superlative here. Actually, Hartford applied for one of those UMTA grants too, but didn't get it. The little people mover car we have here was really a proof of concept, but it never went anywhere beyond the little Bradley Airport installation.
It was really, the lack of the subway or circulation downtown, which is really, so critical to expansion of transit. It's just a shame, it never got built. It was kind of resurrected as the dual hub corridor project under Ron Tober as general manager. And it was supposed to be light rail. And now, eventually morphed into bus rapid transit. So it's the health line is basically provides some distribution through downtown, but it's there's not much downtown to distribute anymore, unfortunately.
And in the chat, Steve Heister from Northern Ohio Railway Museum noted that airporters 161 and 172 are at Norm, and 163 is at Ohio Railway Museum.
Oh, as far as new cars go, because I did see some kind of chat about new cars. Apparently, RTA has settled on Siemens as their new rail car provider. It was the only bid the first time, and apparently the only bid second time. No one else was interested in bidding on it, because these cars will finally be what Blaine Hayes and a lot of other people were pushing for years, capable of high level and low level boarding. So low level on Shaker, high level on CTS Rapid. So they can have one fleet of cars that's universal across everything they run, which makes a lot of sense. Made a lot of sense years ago. It makes a lot of sense now. So I think these are based on San Francisco Muni has a new fleet of Siemens S70 cars. It's based on the S70 platform that have both high-level boarding for their subway on Market Street and then low-level boarding when they get out of the subway onto the street. So good for them. I'm glad. They don't have enough money tied up to pay for the cars, but I think they're going to go after some money out of the infrastructure program that was passed a while back to pay for them. So that's good.
But the donations tonight go to the museum, not to the RTA car procurement, right?
It's up to PTM.
Yeah.
Could you discuss or say something about Harry Christensen? He's the only railfan author I've ever read who hated with a vengeance modern transit.
Yeah, he sure did. He was like in favor of jetpacks and gravitation and stuff. So
I remember in his last book he
it was
said
the future.
Nobody would ever build another streetcar in the country.
Yeah.
And therefore Shaker was going to be a busway at best.
Well, and that concept unfortunately has come up recently because a ridership on Shaker is probably in the range of a couple thousand, 2,000 to 3,000 a day or so. So it's very low. I was really concerned that if they weren't able to purchase the cars, they might just throw the towel in. There was some talk about, just running rail to Shaker Square, or not running rail at all, just using it as a BRT guideway. But one of the issues with BRT is the grades coming out of the terminal up to Shaker Square are pretty steep. In fact, the PCC's had some issues, not so much in tackling the hill going up, but dynamic braking coming back down the hill. And when they did analysis of using BRT buses, they would have a hell of a time getting up the grade because it's a sustained grade, a long sustained grade of a couple miles. And then, of course, in the snow and the ice, that's not a great thing for a BRT vehicle either.
So what is the ridership on Shaker? Is it basically on the top of the hill, or is it ridership into Cleveland? Or is it sort of a split?
Well, the old days of Cleveland being this giant employment center, if you look at the folks who lived out in the Heights were business people, lawyers, that's just not happening. That employment just is not very, very big anymore in downtown Cleveland. So the ridership base is just really, is really low because downtown employment has kind of tanked. It's not the city it used to be. So that's a lot of it. There's just not a lot of reason to go downtown.
So then most of the ridership is just within Shaker.
No, there's still some stuff going downtown. There is some ridership going downtown, but it's nowhere near, 4-car trains loaded, like it used to be in the 80s even. I mean, those days are gone. One of the mistakes Shaker made when they rebuilt the line was the contractor, as a value engineering proposal, said, if you let us shut the whole line down, we can get it done much faster. So they did that, and they ran buses, shuttle buses, while they shut the rapid down. And a lot of people never came back. They were like, the hell with this, I'm not riding buses, I'm not getting packed on this thing. They should have really single tracked around construction. They would have retained a lot of ridership. That was a big mistake. It saved them a lot of money on the capital side, but I think they lost a lot of ridership. When you ride transit, it's like a habit. People have a transit. They call it a ridership habit because you have to stand out there. You have to get up. You have to go to a stop. You have to wait for the train. It's cold. It's raining. All those things, but it's kind of a habit you stick with. Once you kind of break the habit, it's tough to get back. It's easier to get in your car and just drive. And parking became very ample downtown with the destruction of a lot of buildings and a lot of parking lots being built. And then even under Cleveland Union Terminal, there's a huge parking lot where the trains used to run as well. The railroad side is paved and used as a parking lot as well. So parking is ample for sure. And business is just down. It's not the same downtown it used to be.
What are the headways on Shaker and on the weekday base headways on Shaker and the Rapid?
I think Shaker is something like 15, 20. It's not very frequent. I don't know what it is on heavy rail. Maybe 10 minutes. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody can answer from the Northern Ohio group.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't believe in that map just how many interstates there are around Cleveland compared to some other cities. I mean, I guess like Cleveland used to be much bigger than it is now when they were being built, but it just seems like there were a lot of interstates there.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's like I said, because I lived through it when I was a kid. I mean, the West Side neighborhoods just got decimated. I mean, they were just barely hanging in there already. And then when that came along, and then eventually busing came along as well, and it just that was like the death knell for a lot of those neighborhoods. People just got the heck out of there.
Yeah.
If I can interject for a second, the new cars they're getting from Siemens are going to be replacing the red line cars.
Oh, they're not replacing Shakers?
They don't have enough money to. They're only doing the red lines. the reason they are doing that is because they're having problems with the frames are rusting on them.
Yeah, the truck bolsters on the Tokyo cars are falling apart.
That's where the big problem is, which of course, we're going to be poking around quite extensively when it comes time to get one.
Yeah, no kidding.
Sure we get a good one.
So I didn't know that there were no cars dedicated to Shaker. That makes me start fearing that Shaker may go at some
No, they
point.
want to. I've been told they want to. They're searching for the money to do those too.
Yeah, hopefully the infrastructure bill can pay for some of this stuff. I know they're going to be applying for some grants. And when you think about it, it's really not a heck of a lot of money. I mean, compared to other major capital projects, it's not a lot of money just to buy some cars. I mean,
Well, they actually want to do something that Harry Christensen proposed and many other people did, run from Shaker Heights straight to the airport.
yeah, that was kicked around. When they bought the Illinois Terminal double end cars, they were actually, the roll signs had airport in there. That was one of the ideas, was to start running through service, which always made a lot of sense because the Shaker crowd was kind of the business guys, going to the airport crowd. It would have made a lot of sense to run, a train every hour or something from Shaker direct to the airport. I always thought that'd be a great idea. Makes a lot of sense.
Getting around to doing something it should have done years ago. So
Yeah.
Well, since you sort of got into this, if they ever put in the CCC Amtrak train,
Oh yeah.
what would that do to Shaker and to the airport?
Good
I have
question.
no idea.
I don't even know where you'd bring a train into Cleveland anymore, unless you use the lakefront station, which is just a trailer basically.
It would have initially it probably would be the lakefront station. There have been occasionally somebody comes up with the idea of moving the Amtrak station to opposite the airport, but between the traffic, going in and out of Rockport and everything out there, I don't even know where they put platforms and put a station and all that kind of stuff.
Is the lakefront line open again, or is it still closed?
No,
It's closed.
not yet. I watched the RTA bidding list for seeing what they're doing, and they have let some grants or they're letting contracts go for like fixing up the West Third station because it hasn't been used in quite some time. But supposedly they're supposed to they're coming up with an engineering plan to fix the bridge over Norfolk Southern there. That's the problem. They put in this state-of-the-art pre-stressed concrete prefab kind of bridge or something, and it started developing cracks. And they initially had it that, okay, the trains are going to go slower over it. Then they got down to one train only on it. Then eventually it was nothing runs. And they put up braces to make sure it doesn't fall on anybody.
This is, I don't know if you can hear me. This is Alex calling. That bridge is under reconstruction as we speak. It's scheduled to be reopened in time for the football season.
Oh, great. That's great news.
Okay, then that would tie into why they're working on, get the West Third station fixed up as far as sealing cracks and things like that. That makes sense.
Yeah, I just heard that from Joe Schaefer today.
That's good news.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for the breaking news there. Any other questions or discussion for Rich? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, again for joining us. Thank you so much to Rich for the presentation. I can't remember if this is the third or fourth one, but we're always glad when you put something together for us because we know it's going to be very well researched, and we really appreciate you doing that. And thank you again, everybody, for volunteering. If you're a volunteer at one of our fine museums, it is National Volunteer Week. So we really appreciate your dedication and support. And we hope to see you next time in a couple weeks for our McKeesport program. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night.